Okay, let's unpack this whole thing. Imagine you're looking for a new electric car, right, in Europe, and you stumble across something like the BYD Dolphin Surf.
Hmm.
Our sources are really highlighting the price on this one, apparently under 18,000 pounds in the UK.
Yeah, which is, well, it's striking.
Exactly. In a market where, EVs often feel pretty premium, that's not just competitive, it feels genuinely disruptive.
It really does. And it signals something much bigger, I think, than just, a new budget car hitting the market.
Yeah.
What we're actually seeing is this incredibly rapid rise of affordable and increasingly really quite sophisticated electric cars coming out of China. And, well, it's shaking up the whole global auto landscape, basically.
Absolutely. So, our mission for this deep dive, looking at the sources you've gathered, is to try and understand, okay, how did China get here so fast? What does this surge actually mean for the global car market? And crucially, what are the maybe hidden costs or concerns behind that tempting price tag? According to the material, anyway.
Right. Because it's not just about cars anymore, is it?
No, it feels much bigger. It's about shifts in global manufacturing, tech, maybe even geopolitics.
And what's really striking when you look at the timeline and the sources is just the sheer speed of China's automotive development. I
Hmm.
mean, okay, they've been building their industry since joining the WTO back in 2001, but things really seem to kick into high gear with that Made in China 2025 initiative.
Ah, right, from 2015. That was the one targeting high tech sectors, wasn't it? Including EVs.
Precisely. And as rivals claim in the sources we looked at, state funding seems to have played a really significant role there. This basically allowed companies like BYD, which interestingly started out making batteries, not cars, allowed them to grow at this incredible pace.
Okay.
And it also meant Chinese parent companies could push the brands they own, like, MG in the UK or Volvo in Sweden, really hard into the electric space.
And the sources seem pretty clear now. Quality isn't really the question it might have been years ago.
Mhm.
They describe the standard of these cars as very, very high indeed.
Oh, yeah, definitely. They've become formidable manufacturers very, very
So
quickly.
it's not just cheap, it's actually good.
Right. And the cost advantage, it isn't just one single thing. The material points to a combination of factors. You got this really intense, almost cutthroat domestic competition within China itself that forces companies to be super efficient.
Hmm.
Then there are lower labor costs compared to the West, obviously. And yes, the claims that kept coming up from competitors about significant government subsidies giving them an edge.
An unfair edge, they'd argue.
That's the claim. And on top of all that, they've built this incredibly deep integrated supply chain right there in China.
That UBS report you found from late 2023, that really put a number on it, didn't it? Suggesting BYD can build a car something like 25% cheaper than Western competitors.
It did, yeah. A huge gap. Though it's interesting, the sources offer different takes on why that gap is so big. You also see Xpeng's vice chairman, for instance, saying, well, yes, maybe subsidies helped, but actually, our competitiveness comes from fighting tooth and nail through the most competitive market in the world.
Right. So suggesting it's the internal market dynamics, the sheer pressure cooker of competition that's also forging these efficient companies.
Exactly. It's likely a mix of both, I suspect.
So whether it's subsidies, brutal competition, maybe both, the end result is this massive cost advantage. And then Europe decides to phase out petrol and diesel cars, which kind of created the perfect storm, right? An opening.
Absolutely perfect timing for them, you could say. Just as European manufacturers were wrestling with the huge cost and complexity of switching to EVs at scale, well, it basically opened the door wide for these really cost competitive Chinese companies to jump in and grab market share. The whole landscape was shifting underfoot.
And they're not just like knocking politely, they seem to be charging right through that door.
Yeah,
BYD overtook Tesla globally, didn't they, at the start of this year?
they did. And they're expanding aggressively in Europe. The sources mention company directors stating goals, like becoming number one in the UK market within 10 years.
Wow. That's ambitious.
It is. And it raises this, key question. How quickly are brands like Neo, Xpeng, Zeekr, Omoda, are they going to become as familiar on our roads as, say, a Ford or a VW?
Yeah.
The row motion data for 2024 is pretty telling.
Hmm.
Chinese brands apparently already had 10% of global EV and plug in hybrid sales outside of China
10% already.
already, and that's only expected to grow.
And it's not just the cheap runabouts like that Dolphin Surf we mentioned either. The sources talk about the sheer breadth of what they're offering from those affordable city cars right up to, well, ultra luxury supercars like BYD's Yangwang U9.
They're covering the whole spectrum, yeah, which presents this almost existential challenge for the established European car makers. Professor David Bailey is quoted with a pretty stark warning, saying they could be wiped out if they can't catch up with China's efficiency and, crucially, their lead in battery tech.
Wiped out. That's strong language. It kind of echoes what we saw in other sources, like the Alliance for American Manufacturing, calling this an extinction level event for the U.S.
It
industry.
does. And you've had European leaders like Commission President Ursula von der Leyen publicly worrying about huge state subsidies distorting the market.
So the concern is definitely there at high levels.
And those concerns have led to actual action, haven't they? Especially in the US and the EU. The US, for example, massively hiked its import tariffs on Chinese EVs in 2024 from 25% straight up to 100%.
Which our sources note Beijing immediately called naked protectionism.
Understandably, perhaps. Meanwhile, the EU brought in extra tariffs too, up to 35.3% starting October 2024.
But the UK, interestingly, based on the material we have, hasn't gone down that same tariff route.
Not yet, anyway. And Matthias Schmidt, an analyst cited, suggests these EU tariffs will probably make it harder now for the Chinese makers to just pass on that full cost advantage. He said the door was wide open before, but now there's, a significant hurdle.
Right. So the Western response isn't just tariffs, is it? It's also about trying to adapt to compete head on.
Exactly. European manufacturers are scrambling to develop their own affordable EVs. Renault's plant in Douai, France, is mentioned as a key example.
Okay, what are they doing there that's different? How are they trying to compete on cost?
Well, they've basically built this ultra modern EV hub, and they're adopting techniques like uh, lean production, really focusing on efficiency, cutting waste, and also keeping their suppliers physically very close to the factory, trying to streamline everything.
So, kind of mirroring some of the efficiency tactics that made the Chinese companies so competitive in the first place.
In a way, yes, learning from that intense competition.
But Renault is also doing something else interesting, leveraging their history, right? With the new Renault 5e tech.
Ah, yeah, that's a great point. They're tapping into that heritage, bringing back a classic design for the electric age. That's something that newer Chinese brands just don't have, that decades long brand recognition and sort of emotional connection. So they're competing on nostalgia and design too, not just price.
It's a multi front battle then economics, technology, even culture.
Definitely.
Hmm.
But as these cars become more common, and especially given how connected they are, another layer of concern pops up in the sources, something beyond market share.
Ah, you mean the security angle? Because these cars are basically like rolling computers now, connected to the internet, getting over the air update.
Exactly. That technology, which Tesla really pioneered but is now pretty standard, opens up new possibilities, but also new worries. The sources raise concerns that these vehicles, especially if they have Chinese software or key components, could potentially be, well, hacked.
Hacked how?
Used for spying, maybe,
Yeah.
monitoring people, or even in a more extreme scenario, being remotely shut down, immobilized.
Right, I remember reading that. There were specific reports cited, weren't there? Like a British newspaper piece saying military types were advised not to discuss sensitive stuff in EVs and banning cars with Chinese parts from secure locations.
hmm And that quote from Sir Richard Dearlove, the former MI6 chief, raising the possibility of remotely controlled tech being used to, his words, immobilize London. Pretty dramatic stuff.
It is serious.
Yeah.
So, what's the response from China on this?
Well, according to the sources, Beijing's response is pretty straightforward: flat denial. They've consistently rejected any accusations of espionage. The Chinese embassy in London called these specific allegations entirely unfounded and absurd. They emphasize secure supply chains, say their firms follow local laws, and argue there's just no credible evidence of any actual security threat.
Okay, so you've got these quite alarming warnings on one side and very firm denials on the other. How do we navigate that based on the material?
It's tricky. Joseph Chernecki from the RUSI think tank offers a more maybe balanced perspective in the sources. He argues that yes, risks probably do exist with any connected tech, but they can be mitigated.
Oh.
Well, he points out that the Chinese car companies themselves have a massive vested interest in not being seen as a security risk. It would kill their international growth plans.
Good point. Bad for business.
Exactly. And he also suggests the Chinese government's main goal is likely economic growth right now, not jeopardizing global trade for perhaps limited surveillance gains.
Mm.
His take seems to be that the real key is for Western regulators to get the resources they need to properly monitor the cybersecurity of all these connected vehicles, wherever they come from.
Which feels kind of pragmatic, especially when you consider the other point raised. Chinese tech is already everywhere, right? It's embedded in our economies, needed for things like climate goals, and loads of non Chinese cars already use Chinese components anyway.
That's a crucial point. Dan Caesar is quoted suggesting some of it might be fear mongering,
Hmm.
and that really we just have to face the reality that China is and will be a massive part of the global tech landscape.
Yeah.
We have to find ways to work with that securely.
Okay, so pulling it all together from our sources, we've seen this incredible story of speed and cost cutting driving the Chinese EV surge, fueled by fierce domestic competition and, according to rivals, significant state backing.
Yeah, and this is causing huge disruption globally, posing a massive challenge to the old guard automakers.
And the West is responding with a mix of defense, like tariffs and offense, trying to innovate and adapt their own manufacturing, even leaning on heritage.
And then layered over all that economic and industrial change is this really complex, quite sensitive debate about security. You have serious concerns being voiced about connected tech and potential misuse, countered by strong denials and these more pragmatic arguments about managing risk and the realities of, globalized tech supply chains.
Yeah. What seems absolutely clear from all the sources is that Chinese electric vehicles running on Chinese technology aren't just coming, they're here, and they're a powerful growing force shaping the future of driving.
Undeniably.
So it leaves you with a pretty big question to ponder, doesn't it? Given the obvious benefits for consumers, more affordable cars are generally a good thing, and the fact that global manufacturing is so tangled up already, how do we as societies, as individuals, actually balance those benefits against the very real, legitimate concerns about data, about security, about control, in a world where our cars are becoming smarter and more connected every single day?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? It goes way beyond just choosing your next car.